I want to start out with a little interaction here this morning. I'm looking for one word response, or what comes into your mind when I say the word prophet. What was that? Isaiah, okay. What was that? Major. Seer, okay. Picture. Okay. You're just not used to this, right? You know, I was thinking about that this week as I was getting things ready and thinking, okay, what do we tend to think of in terms of a prophet? And it's usually somebody who speaks for God. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, we'll find that the Apostle Paul uses that word, prophet or prophecy. He uses it to talk. It specifically means someone who speaks for God. The word prophet, pro, is somebody who is speaking for someone in that particular case. And so this morning, as we continue our way through the minor prophets, obviously we're doing the book of Habakkuk. And I got to be honest with you that this book of Habakkuk, this may be why I wanted to do the minor prophets. This is my favorite one because for a whole lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that Habakkuk is not like the other prophets. All of the prophets, the minor prophets as well as the major prophets, they all are people who speak to the people for God. He has a message that God has given to him, and so he brings the message and delivers the message the best that he can. And so he is speaking for God. Now, Habakkuk is not like that. As a matter of fact, Habakkuk is exactly the opposite. Habakkuk speaks to God for the people. Now, maybe that's why it comes kind of in the middle of the minor prophets. Chronologically, we're exactly where we were last week. We're at that same point where the northern kingdom has fallen to the hands of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians have dispersed the children of Israel to where they'll be unrecognizable. That's what we call the lost 10 tribes of the nation of Israel. That happened because the Assyrians came and overtook them at that particular point. Now, it's before the fall of the southern kingdom where they are carried off into Babylon, and then they will eventually be able to return as a nation back to Israel. So it's during that time frame. It all happens about 700 years before Jesus is born. And it's a time of turmoil, and as we've talked about, it's a time when people have walked away from the important things of their faith. It seems that worship has just been traded. Worship has been traded for contemporary cultural things. People said, well, this is something that's going on in our culture, so this is good. Let's adopt this and let's make this now part of worship. Now that's what happened to the nation of Israel, and so worship has it's been terribly torn apart and almost unrecognizable to those who really want to follow God. And it's to this type of society that Habakkuk looks into the society and he says, "This got to stop. This is just absolute craziness. Things need to be changed, and we need to come back to God." And he sees everything that's going on, and unlike the other prophets, instead of going to the people, he goes to God. And so the book of Habakkuk it's only 3 chapters long. It's a very small book. It can be read in a very, very short period of time, and it can basically be broken down into 3 things. One of them is, first, it's a conversation between God and Habakkuk. Habakkuk raises his complaints to God. God answers him. Second thing it can be, the same thing happens again. Habakkuk talks to God. God answers him. And then the third is kind of a prayer, or probably more properly, it's probably more of a song that Habakkuk writes. And so he's going to talk about all those kind of things as we go through it. So as we head off this morning, let's ask God for direction. Father, I pray that you would take us through this morning. that you would help us to see who you are, that you would help us to understand what it is that you want to do in our lives. Father, help us to know that you have all things under control. Help us to know that you simply want to meet with us and speak with us as friend with friend. Father, help us to seek that relationship deeper and deeper every day. And as we take a look at your word in this short book of Habakkuk, Father, help us today to see how important it is for us and to understand your truth and listen. Father, I ask that you would use me in spite of myself. Father, I stand as someone who is a struggler with sin. And I ask that you would forgive me for my sins and sinfulness, that you would use me in spite of myself. But that my words this morning to my friends would not be mine, but they would be yours. Help us just to follow where you want us to go and make that our prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen. So if you've got your Bibles or if you've got a Bible app or something like that, then I want you to turn to the book of Habakkuk, and you can kind of thumb back and forth through that. So we're going to walk through that a little bit here this morning as we spend some time together. And I'm going to start out in the first chapter and the second verse. And it looks like this. How long, this is Habakkuk speaking to God, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, and there is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem into righteous so that justice is perverted. He raises the word violence. He says, everything around me, people around me are just so violent. You know, we live in a time and a place where there seems to be so much violence going on in our society. And we tend to think that maybe this is the first time that these kind of things have ever happened. But the truth is that it's been like this for many, many, many years. But it does describe the things that we go through in our society as well. It's interesting, and as he comes to his first, at the end of his first discourse with God, he says the law is paralyzed. He says justice never prevails, and justice is perverted. I like the way that the message translates that verse. It says that justice is a joke. Sounds a little bit like our legal system sometimes. Is that sometimes there is so much going on behind the scenes and under the scenes, is that well-meaning people are just overcome by things that are happening, and they can't find their way there. It says that justice is just a joke. And so he talks to God. He says, "Why do I have to go through this? Why do I have to keep? God, don't you think that you should do something about this? God, this world is just an absolute mess, and don't you think that you could just do something about this?" And so God responds. And that happens in Habakkuk, verses 5 through 11, where God speaks to Habakkuk. This word's of God. God says, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own strength is their God." You get the picture here? Now, here is Habakkuk. He prophesies He prophesies during much the time frame as some of the other prophets that we've already covered. Particularly, we talked about Zephaniah last week, and he's very much during that same time frame. And he's heard Zephaniah talking to the people and saying, you know, what's about to happen is that God is going to take your nation. He's going to give your nation to the Babylonians. And they were staring down the barrel of the Babylonians and their invasion. Habakkuk's not sure about that, though. He says, God, I want you to do something about all of this injustice. I want you to do something about all of this violence. I want you to do something about the very fact that the children of Israel have just walked away from everything. God, I want you to do something about this. And God says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. See that Babylonian army that's lined up? You know what those guys are like. Those are the toughest, meanest, cruelest people on the face of the earth. And I'm going to use them to take care of the nation of Israel. Now that's the first discourse between God and Habakkuk, where Habakkuk says, look, things have got to change in our society. It's not a feeling unlike the feelings that we tend to have, I think, in our lives. So we say, something's got to give. I mean, we look at our nation today, and we say, something's got to give. We can't go on like this. We can't go on where one week you're hearing about this group, the people on this side of the aisle, they're receiving packages that are intended to kill them, and then the next week you hear the people who are on this side of the aisle are receiving packages that are intended to kill them. And so both sides then blame the other side. And I suppose you come in here this morning and you've got your own ideas about who's responsible. Let me tell you something. You're probably wrong, unless you're putting it squarely at the feet of Satan. Because he is the one who is responsible for all this. And it's because in many ways we have turned away. We have made our worship a joke. More often today, worship looks like some type of dog and pony show. It's no wonder the circuses don't exist anymore, because they're in somebody's parking lot on Sunday mornings. And we wonder. We walked away from God. We made worship about us. And God says, that's not okay. That's not okay. And so as a result of that, God tells Habakkuk, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start over with the nation of Israel. They're going to be carried off. And he says what he's going to do now. Habakkuk hears God's words, and Habakkuk has a response to God. And Habakkuk's response to God, pretty honestly, is very simply, I don't think you heard me. Here's what Habakkuk says. He says, O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One. We won't die, O Lord. You have appointed them to execute judgment, O rock. You have ordained them to punish. And let me tell you something. We read it like this and it sounds like a statement, but it's not really. The message, again, Peterson really caught the gist of what was happening here when in Habakkuk 1, 12 and 13, this way the message translates, it says, God, you're from eternity, aren't you? Holy God, we aren't going to die, are we? God, you chose Babylonians for your judgment work? Rock solid God, you gave them the job of discipline? You can't be serious. You can't condone evil, so why don't you do something about this? Why are you silent now? This outrage, evil men swallow up the righteous, and you stand around and watch. And see, he heard what God said. God said, I'm going to use the Babylonians to bring discipline to the nation of Israel. And Habakkuk says, are you kidding me? Not really what I had in mind. As a matter of fact, he goes on and he says, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to stand my watch and I'm going to station myself on the ramparts. I'm going to be watchman, he says. I will look to see what he will say to me, what answer I am to give to God. I'm going to stay here until I get a good answer from you. That's what he's saying. So, God responds again. He's pretty gentle with Habakkuk, in my opinion, because God says, write down, here's what I want you to do. Habakkuk, you get a problem with what's going on, get out your hammer and your chisel, and I want you to write this stuff down. Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. Make sure that you write this stuff down, Habakkuk. Write it down. Write it down so that somebody can take care of it. And he says, for the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks to the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It certainly will come. God says, look, I've got it under control, Habakkuk. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And you know, he doesn't say this so completely to Habakkuk, but he simply says, you don't really understand what's happening. He says, look, it's going to come, what I intended to do. And he's certainly saying, look, I made that promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a long time ago about the nation. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten my promise. It's going to come through. Just wait for it. And here's how it's going to come. And so he launches into this series of 5 woes about the Babylonians and all of the surrounding people. He says, look, everything that they have is stolen. Most of the time, they stole it from their own people. They were unjust in the way that they used their finances. They kept the poor as they could possibly keep them. And God says, look, I have this against them. 5 times in this passage, from about 2nd chapter, verse 6 through probably 19, 5 times God uses the word woe. Now, let me tell you something. When God uses the word woe, that is not a good thing. He says, here's what's going to, everything that they have, everything that these people have is stolen. And he goes, if it wasn't stolen, they cheated to get it. If they didn't just outright steal it, they cheated somebody to get it. And clearly, Habakkuk, you don't think I think that's a good idea, do you? Then he goes on to say, in their kingdom is built on violence. It's built on the blood of other people. You don't think that I think that's a good idea, do you? I mean, woe to them. Habakkuk, I know who these people, the Babylonians, are. And I understand everything that's going on in their life, and they built their kingdoms on the blood of other people. But God said it gets worse than that. Habakkuk, he says, woe to them because these people are completely immoral. They get people drunk so that they can be sexually immoral with them. Do you think I'm standing for this? God says it will be taken care of. And then he says, you know what? Bottom line is, Habakkuk, they only worship false gods. They worship gods made out of wood and stone that aren't real gods. They're not real gods, so don't worry about it. And so then God finally says, in chapter 2, verse 20, he says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. And let all the earth be silent. Habakkuk, I've got it taken care of. I've got it taken care of. So the first conversation that they have is Habakkuk says, look, God, you got to do something about what's going on. God says, okay, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to send the Babylonians, and they're going to discipline the nation of Israel. The second conversation they have, Habakkuk says, that's not what I had in mind. I mean, you're just going to replace us with them? I mean, they're worse than we are. And God says, no, you don't really understand. He says, look, I've got it under control. I know what kind of people they are, and eventually their destruction will come. Their destruction will come. But understand this, Habakkuk, I have it under control. Now I want to back up a little bit to chapter 2, verse 4. Because there's an important part of the conversation that's going on there with Habakkuk and God. In chapter 2, verse 4, God says this to Habakkuk. He says, I know everything that's going on, and I know about everything that's going on. And I know how people live, and I know how they build themselves up. But he says, here's what I want you to know, Habakkuk. The righteous people, they will live by their faith. The righteous people will live by their faith. Now, if you hadn't gone into a study of the minor prophets of the Old Testament, if you'd just done a casual cursory reading of your Bible, you wouldn't think that this is an Old Testament statement. You would think this sounds like something that would be said by people on on our side of the cross. And it is. In Romans, the first chapter, the 17th verse, the Apostle Paul says, for in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. He quotes Habakkuk. Again, to the Galatian Christians, the same guy, the same Apostle Paul says, clearly, no one is justified before God by the law because the righteous will live by faith. You see, the Babylonians, they lived by sight. They lived by their power. Their might was their God. And God said, look, I understand that, but you, the righteous person, will live by his faith. The writer of Hebrews says, for in just a very little while he who is coming, this is the 10th chapter, for in just a very little while he is coming, he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. And if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. He will live by faith. Now the writer of Hebrews says this in the 10th chapter. Now, all of you Bible scholars, do you know what comes after the 10th chapter of Hebrews? The 11th chapter. Every time. No matter what translation you're reading from, it's the 11th chapter. We call it the faith chapter. And that first verse in the 11th chapter just kind of kicks it off. It says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we don't see. That's what faith is. That's what faith is. A little bit later in this same letter, the writer of Hebrews is going to say, and without faith, it's impossible to please God. I don't care what you do, I don't care how hard you try. Unless you have faith, it's impossible to please God. That's important because that's what carries through to us. Is that righteousness isn't accomplished by the things that we do. It isn't accomplished by the questions that we have. Look at this conversation that goes on between Habakkuk and God. Habakkuk's not afraid to question God. That doesn't make him a faithless person. And doesn't make us a faithless person when we question the things that are going on or when we ask God questions. That doesn't make us faithless. That just makes us the way that we are, and that's part of our conversation. That's part of our communication with God. And this is what faith is all about. It's being sure of what we hope for, and it's certain. And faith does so many things. Because you read the rest of that 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, and it tells you some of the things that faith does. It closes the mouths of lions, bringing up the thought of a guy by the name of Daniel. It restores people from the dead. This is God at work. And he goes on and he launches into several stories about particular faith. And then he continues on and he says, oh, and by the way, by faith, some people were cut in two. Some of them were killed in other ways. Because let me tell you something, faith is about more than this world. And if you have faith just so that you can have your best life now, you missed it. Because faith is about preparation for eternity. And that's what God does. And Habakkuk hears these words. And he responds to God in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2. He says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day, in our time, make them known in wrath. Remember mercy. You see, now he gets it. Now he gets it. The top of your passages might say something about a prayer, the prayer of Habakkuk, but it's really more than that. Because all the terms that are used in there are musical terms. And one of the things that we know clearly from here is that Habakkuk's a musician. And he's had this discourse with God, and now he wants to put it to words. He wants to put it to word and to music probably as well. Because the rest of chapter 3 is a song. It's a song. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 17. He now picks up and because every songwriter knows that, man, when you come to the end of the song, it's time for the big finish. And so Habakkuk says, here's the big finish to my song. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. I'll be joyful. It doesn't matter what's happening. Even if it looks like I'm losing, I know that I'm winning because God is in control. And then the last verse says, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. And then it ends with this curious little phrase, for the director of music on my string instruments. Translate that best by saying, okay guys, grab your guitars. Because Habakkuk says, I've had an encounter with God. I've had an encounter with God, and I've spoken with him about the nation. I am troubled by my society. And man, let me tell you something. I can feel with him. I look at my society, and I am troubled, and I think, God, how much longer are you going to put up with this? And hopefully we're not staring down the barrel of the Babylonians. It's happened many times in history. Hopefully at some point, maybe it's at this point, and I know that there are several of you who got this all figured out, but maybe it's at this point that God's going to say, okay, this is it. This is the culmination of the age. But I do know this. Is that while I'm here, I am challenged by God to live by faith. It's not about the things that I say. Oh man, we live in a day and age where you can see everything. But that's not what faith is. Faith is about knowing that God is in control and that God is at work no matter what I see. Faith doesn't say, well, you know what, my coffers and my finances are a little bit low, so I guess what I'll do is I'll send $20 to my favorite guy and he promised me he's going to multiply it. That's not faith. That's sight at best. Faith says, even though things are tough, even though it looks like we're not winning, even though it just doesn't seem to be playing out, God overcomes. Faith reaches into my life and to your life. Faith helps me live every day knowing that my life isn't determined by who sits in the Oval Office or who's the Speaker of the House. My God is on the throne. Faith it's not about what I've got in my checking account. For goodness sakes, the Bible says that he owns the cattle on thousands of hills. He can take care of it. Faith isn't about, does it look like things are going in the wrong direction for me? Faith is understanding that God is under control. And my prayer for all of us is that we would learn this day from Habakkuk, because he worked it out. Clearly, he works it out. He says, look, God, something's got to give. God says, okay, something's going to give. It's the Babylonians are going to come and take over. And Habakkuk says, no, that's not what I had in mind. They're worse than we are. God says, look, don't worry about it. They're going to come because you're going to be disciplined, but they're not going to stay. Because one day we'll all be restored. But in the meantime, I don't want you to live by your power. I want you to live by your faith. And that's what he calls us to do. And I pray this morning that you too would learn to live and walk in your faith. And Father, I pray this morning that you would help us to see and to know. Help us to trust that you can do what you want to do whenever you want to do it. And Father, I pray this morning that you would help all of us to know that when you have everything under control, it's for our best and for your glory. Help us to trust you this day. Help us to live, help us to walk not by our sight, but help us to live in faith of what you can do. Not faith in what we can do, but faith in what you can do. Because there is no better way. In the name of Jesus.